Daniel Carter had spent the last 10 years as a janitor at the prestigious Wellington Enterprises. His days were spent mopping floors, cleaning windows, and ensuring that the towering office building gleamed for its wealthy occupants. But no one truly saw him, except for Eleanor Sinclair, the company's owner and a recently widowed business tycoon. Eleanor, a woman of elegance and sharp wit, had inherited her late husband's vast empire. She had everything: power, wealth, influence, but what she lacked was trustworthy people. One evening, as Daniel was emptying the trash in the executive lounge, Eleanor sat alone by the window, gazing at the city skyline. She watched Daniel, his meticulous work, his quiet dedication. Something about him intrigued her. "Daniel," she called out unexpectedly. He straightened up, surprised. It was rare for the elite to address him by name. "Yes, ma'am?" She smiled. "Would you join me for a meeting tomorrow morning?" Daniel blinked. "A meeting?" "Yes. 10 a.m. My office." Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure if this was a joke or a mistake. "Are you sure, ma'am?" Eleanor chuckled. "Very sure. Don't be late." As she walked away, Daniel stood frozen. Why would one of the richest women in the country invite a janitor to a business meeting? Little did he know, this meeting would change his life forever. Daniel Carter arrived at Eleanor Sinclair's office at exactly 10 a.m. His hands were slightly sweaty, and his heartbeat quickened as he stood outside the large mahogany doors. He had spent the night tossing and turning, wondering why a billionaire widow would call him, a janitor, to a business meeting. The receptionist, a polished woman in a navy blue suit, gave him a curious glance before nodding. "Go right in, Mr. Carter. She's expecting you." Taking a deep breath, Daniel pushed the doors open. Eleanor sat behind a massive glass desk, sipping coffee as she gestured for him to sit. "Good morning, Daniel," she greeted warmly. "Good morning, ma'am," he replied cautiously, lowering himself into the leather chair. Eleanor leaned forward, her piercing blue eyes studying him. "You've worked here for how long?" 10 years, Daniel answered. "And in those 10 years, you've watched and listened, haven't you?" she asked, tilting her head. "You know more about this company than most of my executives." Daniel hesitated. "I suppose I notice things." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Exactly. You see, Daniel, my late husband built this empire, but I don't trust the people around me. I need someone with a fresh perspective, someone honest, and I believe that's you." Daniel's eyes widened. "Me?" "Yes. I want to offer you a position. Not as a janitor, but as my personal advisor." Silence filled the room. Daniel's heart pounded. Was this some kind of test? A joke? Eleanor sipped her coffee and watched his reaction. "What do you say, Daniel?" Daniel swallowed hard. He never saw this coming. Daniel stared at Eleanor, his mind racing. Had he heard her correctly? A personal advisor? "Ma'am," he began carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm just a janitor. I don't have a degree or business experience." Eleanor chuckled softly, placing her coffee cup down. "That's where you're wrong, Daniel. You may not have a degree, but you have something more valuable: insight." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I don't understand." Eleanor leaned forward. "For 10 years, you've cleaned these halls, emptied office trash bins, and overheard conversations. You know who truly works hard and who only pretends. You've seen corruption, dishonesty, and wastefulness that my executives would never admit to me." Daniel swallowed. It was true, he had noticed things. Employees taking credit for others' work. Unnecessary spending. Secret office politics. But what did that have to do with him? "I need someone I can trust, Daniel," Eleanor continued. "Someone who sees the company from the ground up, not just from the top. That's why I want you as my personal advisor. You'll help me clean house, starting today." His hands gripped the arms of the chair. This was insane. "And what if I say no?" Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Then you go back to cleaning floors." But if you say yes, she slid a folder across the desk. You start with a six-figure salary and an office down the hall from mine. Daniel's breath caught. 6 figures? That was more money than he'd ever imagined. Think about it, Eleanor said, standing up. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come twice. Daniel sat there, stunned. His entire life had just changed, if he had the courage to accept it. Daniel sat in his tiny apartment that night, staring at the contract Eleanor had given him. The numbers on the paper were surreal: a 6-figure salary, full benefits, and a position of influence within the company. But could he do it? Could a janitor really step into a role that important? Doubt crept into his mind. He had spent a decade being invisible, just another worker pushing a mop. People ignored him, talked down to him. And now, he was supposed to advise the most powerful person in the company. His phone buzzed. It was his younger sister, Mia. Hey, big bro. Just checking in. You sound weird. What's up? Daniel hesitated, then sighed. Mia, something crazy happened today. He explained everything: meeting Eleanor, the job offer, and the enormous salary. There was silence on the other end before Mia practically screamed, Daniel. Are you serious? What's there to think about? This is your shot. I don't know, Mia, he admitted. What if I fail? Her voice softened. You won't. You're the hardest worker I know. And let's be real, how many times have you told me about shady stuff happening in that company? Eleanor trusts you. And you deserve better than what you have now. Daniel closed his eyes. Mia was right. He had spent too long doubting himself. The next morning, he walked into Eleanor's office, contract in hand. She looked up from her desk, raising an eyebrow. I'm in, he said firmly. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. Good. Welcome to the real work, Daniel. Let's shake things up. He had no idea just how much his life, and the company, was about to change. Daniel adjusted his tie nervously as he stepped into the towering corporate office. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive coffee. Worlds away from the janitor's closet he used to call his workspace, employees passed by, some throwing him curious glances, others ignoring him entirely. To them, he was still the janitor, no matter what title Eleanor had given him. A sharply dressed assistant approached. Mr. Daniels, Ms. Sinclair is waiting for you in the executive conference room. Mr. Daniels. The name felt foreign. He followed the assistant through the marble-floored halls until they reached a massive boardroom. Inside, a long table was filled with high-ranking executives, their expressions a mix of boredom and skepticism. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her presence commanding as always. She gestured toward the empty seat beside her. Take a seat, Daniel. He did, feeling the weight of a dozen eyes on him. One of the executives, a middle-aged man with silver hair and an expensive suit, leaned forward. Eleanor, with all due respect, why is the janitor sitting at this table? Murmurs of agreement followed. Daniel's hands clenched under the table, but Eleanor remained unfazed. She smiled coolly. Because I trust his insight more than I trust some of yours. Silence. Eleanor continued. Daniel has spent years seeing this company from the ground up. He knows what's broken and what's working. Unlike some of you, he doesn't operate from an ivory tower. Another executive scoffed. And you expect us to take business advice from someone who was cleaning floors last week? Daniel took a deep breath. The old him would have stayed silent. But not today. He leaned forward. You don't have to take my advice, he said. But if you don't start listening to the people who actually keep this company running, you'll watch it collapse from your leather chairs. A heavy pause. Eleanor smirked. Well said, Daniel. The executives weren't convinced yet. But they would be. This was just the beginning. The tension in the boardroom was thick. Daniel could feel the weight of their skepticism pressing down on him. He wasn't just an outsider, he was a threat to their comfortable way of doing business. Eleanor tapped her manicured fingers on the table. Daniel, why don't you tell us what you observed while working here? Daniel hesitated for only a second before speaking. For years, I cleaned these halls, emptied the trash in your offices, and overheard conversations you never thought twice about. I know the people who make this company run, the ones who don't sit at this table. And let me tell you, they're not happy. A murmur spread through the room. Some executives exchanged uneasy glances. The silver-haired executive from before leaned back, crossing his arms. So what exactly are you suggesting? Daniel met his gaze without flinching. That this company has a serious morale problem. Employees feel unheard, underpaid, and replaceable. If you don't fix that, you'll lose the best workers you have. A younger executive, a woman with sharp eyes, tilted her head. And what's your solution? Daniel took a deep breath. Start by listening. Hold town halls with employees, not just management. Offer real incentives for performance, not just empty words. And stop treating people like cogs in a machine. Silence, then, Eleanor smiled. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. The silver-haired executive scoffed. Eleanor, this is ridiculous. You're putting company decisions in the hands of a janitor? She turned to him, her expression ice-cold. No, I'm putting decisions in the hands of someone who actually understands this company from the inside out. Daniel felt a surge of confidence. This was his moment. And he wasn't going to waste it. Daniel's words had left the room in stunned silence. He could feel the weight of their judgment, but he stood tall. This was his chance to prove he wasn't just a janitor, he was someone who understood the heart of the company better than anyone. Eleanor leaned forward, her sharp gaze sweeping across the board members. I believe Daniel has made some excellent points. The employees are the backbone of this company, and it's time we start treating them as such. The silver-haired executive, Richard, scoffed. With all due respect, Eleanor, you're letting sentimentality cloud your judgment. We have analysts, HR professionals, and experienced managers for this sort of thing. Eleanor didn't even blink. And yet, none of them have been able to solve the growing discontent among our workforce. She turned to Daniel. You've seen it firsthand. Tell us, what's the biggest complaint from the workers? Daniel didn't hesitate. They don't feel valued. They put in long hours, but management only notices them when something goes wrong. Promotions go to the same people while hard-working employees stay stuck in the same positions for years. They want opportunities. They want respect. A few executives shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. They knew he was right. Eleanor nodded. And if we don't change, what do you think will happen? Daniel met her eyes. They'll leave. Or worse, they'll stay but stop caring. And when people stop caring, the quality of work drops, and customers notice. Richard leaned forward, his expression skeptical but intrigued. And what would you do to fix this, if you were in charge? Daniel exhaled. He knew this was the real test. He straightened his shoulders. I'd start by meeting with employees on the ground level, department by department. I'd establish an incentive program that actually rewards hard work. And I'd make sure management is accountable, not just employees. The room was silent again, but this time, it wasn't skepticism filling the air, it was consideration. Eleanor finally spoke. I want you to draft a proposal, Daniel. Show us exactly how you'd implement these changes. Daniel blinked. A proposal? That meant she was taking him seriously. Richard smirked. Let's see if the janitor can handle the pressure of real business. Daniel met his stare and smiled. You'd be surprised what janitors are capable of. Daniel sat in his small apartment, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The weight of the task ahead was pressing down on his shoulders. A proposal? He had never written one in his life. But this was his chance. He couldn't afford to fail. He pulled out his old laptop, its keys worn from years of use. The screen flickered as he opened a blank document. His mind raced. Where did he even begin? Then he thought back to his years at the company. The late-night shifts, the conversations he had overheard, the complaints workers shared in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. He had spent years absorbing the struggles of employees, and now, he had to turn those struggles into solutions. He typed the title, A New Vision for Winslow Enterprises. His fingers hesitated before he started writing. 1. Employee recognition growth. Implement a mentorship program where senior employees guide junior staff, ensuring skills are developed and promotions are based on merit, not favoritism. Performance-based incentives. Introduce a fair reward system that recognizes hard work with bonuses, extra days off, and public recognition. Open communication. Monthly town halls where employees can speak directly to management without fear of retaliation. Fair wages, work-life balance. Adjust pay scales to match industry standards and offer more flexible schedules to prevent burnout. As the hours passed, the proposal took shape. It wasn't just a list of ideas, it was a blueprint for change. By the time dawn approached, Daniel leaned back and exhaled. He had done it. The proposal was finished. Now, all that remained was presenting it to the board, but doubt crept in. Would they take him seriously? Or was this all just an elaborate joke to them? One way or another, he was about to find out. The day had arrived. Daniel stood in front of the towering Winslow Enterprises building, clutching his proposal tightly. His heart pounded. Dressed in a suit borrowed from a friend, he hardly recognized himself in the building's glass reflection. Inside, Eleanor Winslow was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table in the boardroom. The room was filled with senior executives, men and women in sharp suits, their expressions unreadable. They had no idea why a janitor had been invited to this meeting, and some exchanged skeptical glances. "Mr. Carter, the floor is yours," Eleanor announced. Her voice was calm but commanding. Daniel stepped forward, cleared his throat, and began. "For years, I've worked in this company, not as an executive, but as someone who sees everything from the ground level. I've heard the frustrations of employees, watched talented people leave because they felt unheard, and seen the gaps that stop this company from reaching its full potential." A few board members scoffed. One leaned over to another and whispered, "Is this a joke?" Eleanor shot them a sharp glance, silencing them. Undeterred, Daniel continued, presenting his proposal point by point. He spoke about employee morale, fair wages, and the need for better management strategies. He shared real stories, workers who had been overlooked, employees struggling to stay afloat despite years of loyalty. This isn't just about money. It's about people. And if we invest in our people, this company will thrive in ways it never has before, Daniel concluded, placing his proposal on the table. For a long moment, silence hung in the air. Then, an older board member cleared his throat. "This is quite an insightful proposal," he admitted. "But what qualifies you to tell us how to run a business?" Daniel looked him straight in the eye and smiled. "Because I've been on the other side. And that's the side you've been ignoring." The room tensed. Eleanor leaned forward, her lips curving into a small smile. The tension in the boardroom was thick. Some executives exchanged doubtful glances, while others reviewed Daniel's proposal with newfound curiosity. Eleanor Winslow remained composed, her sharp eyes observing the reactions around the table. One of the board members, a stern-looking man named Richard Caldwell, leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, you make some bold claims. But do you have the financial data to back this up? Business isn't just about feelings." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I anticipated that question." He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "These are internal reports, collected over years. They show the decline in employee retention, the rising costs of turnover, and the inefficiencies caused by poor management. I may be a janitor, but I understand numbers." A woman named Linda Morgan, the company's HR director, skimmed through the papers and nodded. "He's not wrong," she admitted. "We've lost several high-performing employees recently. His analysis aligns with what I've been trying to bring up in our meetings." Richard scoffed. "So, what? We restructure the entire company because a janitor says so?" Before Daniel could respond, Eleanor spoke. "We consider ideas, Mr. Caldwell, no matter where they come from." Her tone was sharp, shutting down further objections. Another board member, a younger man named Thomas Reed, tapped his pen against the table. "I think Daniel's perspective is refreshing. He's offering solutions to real problems. The real question is, what do we do next?" Silence fell again. Some board members nodded in agreement, while others looked unconvinced. Eleanor finally stood. We need time to review this proposal. In the meantime, I have an assignment for you, Daniel. Daniel straightened. Yes, ma'am? She smirked slightly. You're going to spend the next week shadowing some of our department heads. If your ideas hold weight, you'll get the chance to prove it. Daniel's heart pounded. This was more than he had expected. Challenge accepted. Daniel arrived at the company's headquarters the next morning, no longer dressed in his janitor's uniform but in a neatly pressed shirt and slacks. He wasn't here to clean, he was here to observe, to learn, and to prove himself. Eleanor Winslow's assistant handed him an itinerary. You'll be spending the week with department heads from operations, finance, and marketing. At the end of the week, you'll present your findings. Daniel nodded, but he could already feel the tension in the room. Some employees whispered as he walked past. Others openly stared. He knew what they were thinking. What was a janitor doing shadowing executives? His first stop was operations. The department head, Martin Hayes, greeted him with a forced smile. Well, let's see what a janitor can teach us about running a company, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Daniel didn't flinch. I'm just here to learn, he replied, keeping his tone even. Martin led him through the department, showing him how supply chains were managed, how logistics were handled, and where the bottlenecks occurred. Daniel listened carefully, asking insightful questions. By the end of the day, even Martin seemed slightly impressed. Next was finance. Daniel met with Angela Thornton, a sharp and no-nonsense woman who ran the numbers for the company. She barely acknowledged him at first, but as Daniel reviewed the financial reports, he pointed out an unusual expense trend. You're losing money in unnecessary overtime costs. If you streamline shift scheduling, you could save thousands every quarter. Angela raised an eyebrow. That's actually a good point, she admitted. By the end of the day, Daniel realized something. The problems he had observed as a janitor weren't just surface-level issues. They ran deep into the company's structure, and he was just getting started. By the end of the week, Daniel had compiled all his findings. He had spent hours analyzing operations, finances, and employee morale. He saw inefficiencies that others overlooked, wasteful spending that no one questioned, and a disconnect between management and employees that was causing deep frustration. Now, standing in front of the company's top executives, including Eleanor Winslow, Daniel was ready to present. The room was packed. Some department heads still looked skeptical, while others seemed curious. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. Daniel took a deep breath and began, I came here as a janitor, but in just a week, I've seen things that could be costing this company millions. He started, immediately capturing their attention. He moved through his presentation methodically, outlining how the company's supply chain had major inefficiencies, how overtime expenses were bleeding money, and how poor communication between departments led to costly errors. But the most shocking revelation came last. You also have a problem with employee turnover, Daniel said, clicking to the final slide. I spoke with dozens of workers, and most of them don't feel valued. They work hard but feel invisible to management. If this continues, you'll keep losing experienced employees, and replacing them is expensive. Silence filled the room. Some executives exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. Then, she spoke, You've given me a lot to think about, Daniel. Her voice was calm but serious. These insights are sharp, and your perspective is unique. The room held its breath. Was she impressed? Was she insulted? Then, she smiled. I think it's time we talk about your future. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. What would you do in this situation? Let us know in the comments below.